Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Explorers Club. We are in for a very special evening. I'm Katie Losi, Head of Partnerships and Conservation at Natural World Safaris. I've been a member here since 2015, and more recently I was invited to be part of the Public Lecture Committee, part of the heartbeat of this place for over a century, and an honor I share with Callie Broadus, Natalie Cash, and Paul Tangy. Tonight's guest is Dr. Max Graham, founder and CEO of Space for Giants. We were first connected through an elephant collaring expedition in Angola, my first real window into their work. And what struck me was their rare gift of bringing together worlds that don't typically sit at the same table. In doing so, they have built one of Africa's most respected conservation institutions, blending science, law, and investment to protect wildlife across 11 countries. Dr. Graham and the Space for Giants team are collaborative, deeply committed, and behind a lot of the good news that we're getting from the wild heart of Africa. But before we get started today, I want to take a quick poll. Who has been here before? Just raise your hand. Okay. So for those who are here for the first time, to set the scene, I'm standing at a lectern where some of the brightest lights have stood. Jane Goodall, John Glenn, Neil Armstrong, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who got his first research grant here. You're standing, and where you're sitting in a Jacobean townhouse that was built for the grandson of the Singer sewing machine family. Today it's our home and a treasure trove of artifacts and discoveries from across the globe. Perry and Henson's historic sledge is above you there. The stained glass windows are from Windsor Castle. And then in the archives upstairs, there's one of the 13,000 things upstairs is an application for membership from Theodore Roosevelt, where he put being president of the United States as fourth on his list of accomplishments to be considered as a member. Yeah, pretty amazing. But while we're a club grounded in science, discovery, and conservation, many know us as a club of famous firsts. First to the North Pole, first to the South Pole, first to summit Everest, first to the Marianas Trench, first to step on the moon. All of the Apollo landings carried Explorers Club flags. And when you're on your way out, you'll see our famous first plaque where there's a little sliver at the bottom that's empty, and that's for the first person to Mars, which we believe will be an Explorers Club member. Dr. Graham shares that same thread that runs through this place: curiosity, courage, and a hunger to push the boundaries of what's possible to benefit all life. With a PhD in wildlife ecology from Cambridge, he traded academia for a life of intense cockpits and presidential offices, collaring elephants through Angolan minefields, flying into Gabon's remote forests, negotiating across conflict zones in South Sudan, surviving armed ambushes and aircraft failures, and prosecuting poachers in rural courtrooms. He also created the Giants Club, an alliance of African heads of state and leading philanthropists, and has mobilized over $100 million for conservation across the continent. He's a tremendous gift to us all, and we're so happy to have you here, Max. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Max Graham, straight from Kenya today. Yeah. Yay.
Well, that's a slightly daunting introduction. All those firsts. I might be the first to get to the bar and get a gin and tonic, I think. Well, so my African journey started as a boy at school. I was 17, and I wasn't particularly academic. I preferred rugby and girls to academia. And by good fortune, in my biology class, there happened to be one girl. There's always one. And she was a third-generation British Kenyan. And so she invited me to Kenya when I was just 17. And, you know, everything she talked about in terms of the camping experiences she had with her father and the wildlife that used to come outside of her tent, it sounded completely mythical, you know, like Narnia, but with better weather. And yet, when I went there, it was even more than my imagination could conjure. It was just breathtaking. And I'll never forget my first elephant. I mean, you never forget your first elephant. My first elephant that I encountered, I remember driving with Tony, Tana's father, and we're driving down this dirty track, and suddenly this huge animal just came crashing out and was in front of us. I'll never forget just being held by the gaze of that ancient being, 40,000 muscles and that trunk that came up and sniffed the air and looked at us, and then suddenly it crashed across the road. And when it crashed across the road, all of my parents' aspirations that I'd go back and be a good boy and live in Dorset, England, and look after the family farm were destroyed. So after university, I was desperate to get involved in conservation. So I wrote to everyone I could. And some poor mug near Tsavo National Park called Rob, he decided to take me on. And so he took me on to be his volunteer. He was looking after a conservancy called Rukinga. And after about a day, we looked at each other and we both realized that he had no idea what to do with me. So what he did is he lent me a crappy motorbike. It was a really bad motorbike. It was about 250 horsepower, barely worked. And I decided that I was going to study lions. Now, this place, you may know, near Tsavo, this is famous because when the British built the railway, which was called the Lunatic Express, it's famed for man-eating lions, called the man-eating lions of Tsavo. And I didn't know any of this at the time. But I don't know if any of you know about studying lions. To study lions, you have to know about their whisker patterns. So you distinguished individual lions by their whisker patterns. I had a motorbike, and I managed to recruit this guy called Gobo, who is from the local Walingulu tribe, who are traditional elephant hunters, traditionally. Obviously not allowed now, but he was a fantastic tracker. However, approaching lions on a motorbike and taking photographs was causing the owner of the conservancy a lot of anxiety. And after a few near-death experiences, the owner of the conservancy said, look, we have to stage an intervention now. And they took me away from this conservancy and flew me. He flew me up to his conservancy, which sits between Mount Kenya and the Aberdares. It's a little place called Sangari. And he said, Max, I think you're safer here. You can look after the ranch, look after my house, look after the dogs. I'm flying to South Africa. And then he went in his little plane to fly to South Africa for 6 months. And he said, but please do something about these bloody elephants. So I had no idea about ranching or looking after his house or dogs and like that. I went straight for the elephants. I said, I'm going to study those elephants. Now, I don't know if any of you know how to study elephants, but you have to look at their ear patterns. Each elephant has unique veins in their ears, which makes them completely unique. So I now no longer had a motorbike, but I still had Gobo. And Gobo and I would go and track these individual elephants on foot and take photographs of them so we knew exactly where they were going. And after about 3 months, I just had a handheld GPS, a pretty crappy camera. After about 3 months, Gobo turned around to me and he said, Max, when I track elephants, I track them, and then we find them, and then we shoot them. You track elephants, and then you track elephants, and then you track elephants. What are you doing? What's the point of this? And he quit. But by that time, we had managed to collect enough information to understand this corridor between this little conservancy and Mount Kenya. And I was 21 at the time. And with the help of some local researchers, I was able to pull together land ownership in that corridor. It's about 14-kilometer width. And I hired a matatu, which is a local Kenyan bus, and I managed to get all the landowners to get in a matatu, and then we rattled our way down to the coast to a community elephant sanctuary called Mwelaganji. And then we came back from Mwelaganji, and I was so excited. This is my first project. We were going to create this corridor. It was going to be brilliant. And within a week, the death threats arrived. And there were these rumors going around the community that this foreigner was forcing people to give up their land at gunpoint. And the owners of the ranch at South Africa were terrified that they were, what's going on? What's this young man doing? He's creating this real tension. And I was invited to a local meeting by the district commissioner, who was getting very concerned by the anxiety that was being created in the community. I had, at that stage, I'd rented a little Suzuki Jeep, and a local person threw petrol on the Suzuki Jeep and tried to set it on fire. A Kenyan Wildlife Service ranger that I'd been working with got shot in the leg. So suddenly there was all this tension, animosity in the community. So I was invited to this meeting, and I turned up, and the local aspiring member of parliament stood up, and he said, this foreigner, this Mzungu here, he's trying to steal our land, and I'm going to stop him. And everyone cheered. They all cheered. And I was devastated. You know, this dream of this corridor, this first project, suddenly went up in smoke. And I learned my first lesson in conservation, which is that you can have the best of intentions, you can have the best science, but if you don't have the right politics, the right political backing, the conservation outcome you want will fail. So, humiliated, I went to Cambridge, to King's College in Cambridge. I wrote my master's degree thesis, which read more like a Wilbur Smith novel than anything academic, but somehow I convinced my supervisors to allow me to do a PhD. And I went back to Sangari, I went back to the wider landscape, and I really was determined to understand how people and elephants can coexist in a shared landscape. Now, I didn't have the resources for anything exciting like airplanes or GPS collars initially. So what I instead did was count elephant dung, which my parents were so happy about, because elephant dung doesn't charge you or bite you, at least not that I experienced. And so I walked 110 kilometers of transects 4 times to count elephant dung and understand the distribution of elephants in relation to people. But much to the dismay of my academic supervisors, I was finally sponsored to put on elephant collars. Elephant collars don't get put on by themselves, and elephants don't know how to put it on themselves. So this was something that created a lot of anxiety. But Ian Douglas Hamilton, who's one of the foremost experts on elephants, took pity on me and offered to collaborate with me to put GPS collars on elephants. So I put collars on elephants all over Africa. This is in Angola, where we recently put on GPS collars 4 years ago. And it's one of the most extraordinary landscapes. It's in the southeast corner of the country. And there are perhaps 3,000 elephants bunched up in a little group in a small area. And they are the remnants of a huge elephant population that was practically wiped out during the Angolan Civil War. And so in this area where Jonas Savimbi, who was fighting the main Angolan forces and the Russian forces, backed up by the Americans and the South Africans, you've suddenly got blown out tanks and mines. And so putting these collars on was terrifying, because we didn't know when we got out the helicopter, we were going to blow up or what was going to happen. But these elephants are there, and their movement is just fascinating, because some of these elephants, they're transnational, and they're moving across big areas. But I started to really get a sense of individual elephants, just grow in awe of how intelligent and sentient these beings are. I don't know if many of you know, but we now have established that baby elephants that play more live longer. Baby elephants with a grandmother live longer. And male elephants, which have their own society away from the matriarchal-led herds, individual male elephants can be completely different. Some are really gregarious, some are shy, some are aggressive, but it doesn't matter what an individual male elephant's like. Every male elephant has a best friend. And those elephants, what's so interesting, they get into a sexually heightened state called musth, the bull elephants. And when that happens, their testosterone levels can increase up to 4 times. So they're absolutely pumped. And they will fight any other male they can come across to compete over females and estrus. But these best mates make sure they're never in musth at the same time, so they won't fight each other. So we've learned so much in recent times to really appreciate elephants. This is a wonderful map just showing some of our jet-setting elephants moving across 4 different countries. So these guys are moving between Namibia, Botswana, Angola, and Zambia. And what's so fascinating is that a lot of when you listen today about there being too many elephants in Botswana, often people say, too many elephants in Botswana. There are about 200,000 elephants in this population, about 140, which is a big population. But the reality is they're refugees from Angola. And a lot of people don't realize that there's the opportunity to bring the elephants back into Angola. We can take the mines out and make that place safe. They will go back. So these individual elephant movements are informing us about how we can do that in the future, which is one of the most exciting projects that's in our portfolio. The elephants that I'm very familiar with in central Kenya, they are also refugees in Laikipia. In the 60s and 70s, there was major poaching in the north of Kenya, and the elephants moved into central Laikipia, and now it's the second biggest elephant population. You go there, you'd never know. They're actually refugees. And what this tells us is that elephants, their movement, they respond and adapt to risk, and they do it in sometimes the most astounding ways. So the evolutionary adaptability of elephants, they're very much especially these male elephants, but as a species, they have developed the genetic traits to make them highly adaptable, to push boundaries. Matriarchs need this to be able to find food and safety in the context of things changing in time and space, in the context of scarcity when these places are hit by droughts regularly. And bull elephants are genetically compelled to push boundaries so that they can compete for females. And whilst these traits have stood elephants in great stead historically, now in a human world, it creates massive challenges because they are so good, as you can see, at crop raiding. And crop raiding, you have similar situations here in the States with predators taking on livestock and there being conflict. Crop raiding is slightly different in the context of Africa, where an individual farmer is completely dependent on 1 acre of maize for their subsistence. So an 11-ton animal is a bit bigger than a rabbit. And coming through and destroying a single crop in a night creates enormous animosity. And not only does it create a subsistence crisis, but it also undermines political support for conservation. So I've been battling with elephants for 20 years in Laikipia. In central Kenya, we've been in an arms race with elephants to get the right design of fence created. And it's taken us a while, but they're highly, highly adaptable. But we now have a fence design that's keeping out about 90% of the challenges we have where they're well maintained. Even where they're well maintained, you still get an individual elephant like a Genghis Khan who works it out, and putting a collar on them and proactively managing them is all part of what keeps the elephants and the people safe. In somewhere else we work, Gabon's a very different context. Here, these are forest elephants. They're an endangered species compared to their savanna cousins. And in Gabon, you've got such a different context because there, the entire country has got elephants in it. It's the last place in the world like this. There are nearly 100,000 elephants. There are elephants in 48 out of 49 administrative districts in the country. The only place you don't get elephants is in the capital city. That's it. So it's a very different context. So there what we're doing is we're actually fencing farmers in, which I love. And what's been extraordinary about this project is we started a few years ago, but with the change in leadership in the country, we were invited to a meeting by the leadership, and they turned to the conservation community and said, unless you stop this problem, we're sending the army in to shoot the elephants. And so this is what we did.
La forêt est importante pour tout peuple qui vit en Afrique, quel que soit l'endroit. Le fond est important pour tout l'écosystème.
The beauty of the Gabonese forest and the Gabonese people go hand in hand. Nature and culture in this country are one. They're intertwined.
L'éléphant dans nos coutumes bantoues est important. L'éléphant symbolise la force, le courage, la protection. L'éléphant aussi, la boue.
Gabon holds about 70 to 75% of Africa's forest elephant that is critically endangered. Historically, Gabon has prioritized wildlife and elephants particularly. And whilst this is a conservation success story, it has led to problems with food security for some of the local Gabonese farmers who subsist off of agriculture.
Elephants can ruin a year's worth of work in a single night. And so what that creates is not only a food security crisis, but enormous animosity towards a critically endangered species that Space for Giants, has its mission to protect.
The issue that we've been seeing is that human-elephant conflict has been increasing. We are working with the Gabonese government to essentially come up with these solutions and support the problem.
What we have done is we've developed an electric fence model that's adapted to the Gabonese subsistence style of farming.
So we're here today to install that fence and also train the beneficiaries. It is exciting to us because installing that fence, it's an opportunity that we give to her to feed her kids properly.
These electric fences are powered by a solar panel. They're easy to put up, they're easy to understand, but they need to be maintained.
During the installation, we involve the farmers because it is important for us to have them well trained and empowered enough to be able to conduct a basic maintenance.
La clôture électrique mobile est simple parce qu'elle se construit à l'aide des bois de la forêt, accessible à toutes. Cela est une simplicité vraiment extraordinaire.
Moi, ça me réjouit de cette barrière. Au moins, l'éléphant ne pourra plus venir détruire ce qu'on a planté.
Parce qu'à travers ces plantes qui sont dans la barrière, ça nous permet de scolariser nos enfants. Ça nous permet aussi de nous nourrir aussi à travers cela.
It's just one wire, but it's a game changer. Because through that gives people, especially in rural communities, hope.
Space for Giants, has learned a huge amount about working with people and nature. It's a constant learning curve, and to work with the people that live alongside nature and include them from the very beginning is fundamental to the success of any project.
What our vision is for the future is human-elephant coexistence.
Coexistence is possible. That's our hope. That's our mission, that's our vision.
Ultimately, what gives me hope is that the solutions exist. They're already here, they're all around us.
Electric fences are the main strategy to mitigate human-elephant conflict in northern Kenya. And what we see here on this video is incredible. This is up at Suyan Conservancy headquarters. The top elephant is inside the headquarter fence and the bottom elephant is just outside. And what you see here is this incredibly intelligent elephant who's using his tusks, and he's clearly experienced, he's done this before, carefully opening the gate, which is electrified, but tusks don't conduct electricity, and very carefully opening one side, then opening the other side as his buddy waits outside. And he's doing this so that his buddy can enter safely, who is clearly less experienced, so he doesn't know how to do this. Once the fence is open, his buddy can go inside and they can happily go and cooperate and eat some tomatoes and cabbages. It's fascinating to see this behavior, but obviously leaves us with a huge amount of work to do to keep elephants outside.
So they certainly have kept my hands full. But the reality is that it's impossible, it's a big lesson I learned, it's impossible to have a conversation around conservation if wildlife is incurring costs on local people. So that's been a big lesson for me. Once you get ahead of that challenge, then it opens up the opportunity to have a wider conversation. So in Gabon, we're now implementing the biggest intervention of human-elephant conflict in the world. We're building 3,000 fences. And whereas this time last year, the national approach for dealing with the problem was to shoot elephants, the national policy now is to put up more of these fences. So we've managed to at least buy ourselves time for a broader conversation. I founded Space for Giants in 2010, and we had some quick wins in central Kenya. We had a quick win around the right design to combat human-elephant conflict. We worked out you needed intelligence-led approaches to dealing with poaching gangs. And we also learned around improving prosecution guidelines to improve conviction rates. So we had these quick wins. The reason we had those quick wins was because we had a high-level political support in the country. And so at the time, there was an elephant poaching crisis in 2000, from 2010 to 2013 as a consequence of demand for ivory in Asia. And so what we were able to do was to create a forum of African heads of state. Now, how does a kind of weird English guy in Kenya who loves elephants build up that level of support? I have no idea. But we couldn't offer spectacular investment. We had no mining or oil expertise. But there was one thing that I knew that the African heads of state were interested in that I might be able to get hold of, which was positive media support. So I knew a guy who owned a newspaper group, and I've somehow got to him and said, hey, look, if you support us with getting these heads of state to join this club, you can come out to Africa and have lots of selfies with African presidents and enjoy it. And for some reason, that's what he wanted to do. So we created this forum of African heads of state, 4 of them to start with: President of Gabon, President of Uganda, President of Kenya, that's Kenyatta there, and then finally the President of Botswana. And that was an event with the Duke of Cambridge in London where we managed to get all the heads of state in one room, which was really cool. And what that did, I mean, it was amazing. We had a summit in Nanyuki in Kenya in 2016 where we had these 4 heads of state in the room, each one leading a major elephant country, and each leader really being committed to conservation, which is quite unusual on the continent. And it was a very unusual moment in my career where we had political support, technical expertise. We knew the conservation toolkit we needed to implement to move the dial, and we had financial resources in the room. You won't be surprised to hear that all the financial commitments came last, but the political support and the technical support and the dribbling of the financial support actually enabled us to move the dial in terms of lobbying China, in terms of getting ahead of the game with intelligence-led special operations, and moving prosecution guidelines. We became best in class with fantastic lawyers who helped us to build capacity of prosecutors across 11 states in Africa. And I'm really happy to say that now the illegal ivory trade is not the leading cause of elephant mortality in Africa. It's now, sadly, human-elephant conflict. So in Laikipia, where we have 15 collars, for example, 4 of those elephants were killed this year alone through human-elephant conflict, which is unprecedented. We've never had a situation like that. But the ivory trade is no longer what it was. So we've had some real wins. However, in terms of being able to move the dial on some of these issues, it's positive, but I think the reality is there's another elephant in the room. And that is not the ivory trade, it's the loss of habitat. You've got a huge and growing population, you've got a lot of development that's happening, and the wild places that elephants depend on are really coming under threat in a way now that they haven't. There is development happening in Africa at an unprecedented rate. And the big question that I ask myself every day is, how are we going to keep these wild places going? How are we going to keep them going in the face of all this development pressure? So this is a photograph of Loisaba Conservancy. It was a private ranch in a distressed asset in 2011, and we managed to take over the property in partnership with the Nature Conservancy back in 2014. We put ownership into a community trust. And I'm so proud to say that just last year, we brought back black rhino there. It's now employing about 600 people, each with 6 dependents, having a massive community impact. And so a couple of years ago, we decided to do another one. And this is the story. There's a tapestry of habitat and wildlife on Sweden, which in itself is globally significant. So Sweden is a really important conservation asset, but it's also an engine for combating some of the biggest conservation challenges in this landscape and some of the biggest conservation challenges of our time. So it's a sanctuary for wildlife. It's an engine for creating benefits and value for local people. And it's a laboratory for learning how we can do conservation better and scale it up into other parts of the landscape. My name is Max Graham, and I'm the founder and CEO of Space for Giants. We're in Swian Conservancy, which is a really important 44,000 acre sanctuary for wildlife in Laikipia, Kenya. Swian's history is a fascinating story because this land wasn't always a sanctuary for wildlife. In its early days, this was a place for producing sheep. And something really interesting happened in the 1960s and 70s. There was a terrible poaching crisis north of Laikipia, and elephants flooded into Laikipia, and they stayed. And when the first tourism lodges came in the late 1970s, and the property owners could generate revenue from tourists, it started to build this landscape's wildlife economy. Guilfred Powys, he obviously owned this land, but his humility was remarkable. And when he died, his daughters, Anne and Marion, who were the custodians of the land at the time, said that we need to transition ownership of this property into something that's going to persist and endure for the long term. So what Space for Giants did is we raised the money to transition ownership into a Kenyan conservation trust and to create a conservancy. We had some very generous, wonderful philanthropists, Lewis and Sarah Bacon, who got behind that initiative. I'm very proud to say that we're now a fully fledged wildlife conservancy. Previously, we saw cattle as a threat to wildlife and to nature. Now, what we're doing is we're using cattle as an ecological tool.
When I first got to Swian, we had the cattle spread all over the conservancy. So what we've now done is moved from that very spread out system to a more holistic grazing system.
If you graze the land intensely and then you rotate and rest that land for a long period of time, then you get higher and more palatable grasses, and ultimately you can increase your carrying capacity for wildlife.
As much as we use it as a tool for keeping the rangeland healthy, it's also got a massive financial benefit as well. This property has been run off the back of a cow or a sheep since the 60s. So that just gives you a perspective of the power of having a livestock operation.
It's very hard to sustain the costs of running a protected area. And what we're very focused on is doing that in a way that's financially self-sustaining. Partnerships with and beyond allow us to do this. They provide the revenue from conservation fees, from the visitors that come here. So the partnership with and beyond is absolutely key. We need to ensure that communities see Swian as a source of benefit. We've currently got 250 people employed on Swian. Each one of them has 6 dependents. That's a big impact in itself.
The communities are also learning the benefits of conserving the land, conserving the wild animals.
The fences that we do construct prevent these elephants to go and spoil the crops or properties of the community.
Our second-pronged approach is to then deploy a rapid response unit in partnership with the Kenya Wildlife Service, but also using the AppRanger platform through the collared data.
Operation went really well. 3 elephants, all done, all got up nicely, and it's going to help us mitigate human-elephant conflict, so job well done.
Swian is so much more than a pet project. It's in itself got real value. On this place, you have African wild dogs, which are critically endangered. You have leopards, some of them are melanistic, which means they're black. You have one of the only increasing wild lion populations on the continent. You've got Grevy's zebra, which are rarer than rhinos. So Swian's a real gem, and I'm incredibly excited and proud that Space for Giants is engaged in the way it is in this landscape. It's going to create benefits not just for the wildlife here, not just for our neighbours, but for the conservation sector as a whole. So I think the other key lesson that I've learned in my conservation career, and this is probably the most important one, is people protect what they value. And that's something that's so critical. People protect their crops, and people will protect their jobs and their livelihoods. So the big challenge for us as a conservation community is, how do we scale up Sweden, or places like it, and there are many, across the 8,400 protected areas across the continent? At the moment, 90% of these protected areas have no funding. They're what we call in the conservation community paper parks. They're only parks on maps and places like this. On the ground, there's very little there except for quite intense extraction, charcoal burning, overgrazing, encroachment. And the reality is that African governments don't have the resources to prioritize conservation. They're instead focused on poverty eradication, infrastructure, security. What's exciting, however, is that across the continent, there is a new tool that's emerged in the last 10 years, which is called a co-management agreement. And that's where third-party organizations are granted the rights to manage a protected area. And there aren't very many of them, around 40 that occur currently. But where they do occur, there's been this extraordinary transformation in terms of the abundance and diversity of wildlife. So it's been a big win. Currently, there are plans afoot to try and scale up that effort across 163 parks. It's been driven by Rob Walton and his foundation. There are organizations like ours that are right at the coalface of taking this forward. So we've got a co-management agreement over a property called Pinupe, which is Uganda's largest wildlife reserve. It's about 220,000 hectares. And I'm so proud to say that right now, Pinupe is better protected than it ever was. Historically, it was used as a larder by Idi Amin soldiers so that they had meat. And as a consequence, they lost most of their elephants, they lost their rhinos. But what's so exciting is that if you give nature a chance, it bounces back so quickly. The big challenge is, how do we pay for this? So obviously, philanthropy is currently supporting this effort, but that's just about holding the line. We've looked very seriously at carbon credits. In fact, we've got a carbon project over at Pinupe, and that's where, in summary, and I'm not a carbon boffin, so forgive me if anyone is, but it's effectively where your intervention results in additional removal of carbon from the atmosphere. That difference you're able to tokenize and sell to corporations. The market is up and down. A lot of companies right now are scaling back on their 2030 commitments, and as a consequence, we don't know how and when this will come back. But we're hopeful it's a potential source. I mean, we've got 200,000 carbon credits a year potentially coming out of Pinupe. That would cover the cost if there was a good market for them. The other options, biodiversity credits, that's an emerging place. Very similar concept. An intervention creates an additional biodiversity that can offset from a company's negative impacts. My sense is that that's maybe 5 to 10 years away. So we need something else. I feel that the value of nature, the commercial value of nature, is in these incredible images, content. In our social media obsessed world where everything gets commoditized, attaching a brand to these parks, to these assets, to these individual wild animals is a huge opportunity. Park by park, company by company taking this down. And with this huge investment that's happening right now, especially in this country with AI and the massive amounts of resources that are required, there's an opportunity for these big companies to step up and play a role and put nature on the balance sheet. It's plugging nature into the mainstream economy that'll allow us to move beyond what we're doing right now, which is holding the line to enable everyone to be a unit of conservation. And that's really what we're hoping for. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I'll meet you at the bar for anyone who'd like to hear the stories I didn't tell you.
We have time for a few questions, if anyone has any.
Thank you. This was incredible. I've worked with elephants. I didn't know half the things you talked about. I did understand about the human-elephant conflict. What's very interesting, though, about what you talked about is this partnering. How I see that you're doing it with and beyond. Have you approached other like hotel chains? Because there was a real controversial thing that was in the news the last couple of weeks. It was one of the really big chains where the local people said they were forced to sign things that they didn't sign. It's one of the really big hotel chains, and it's the same kind of concept. So how do you get everybody on board to do this?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think what you're talking about specifically is the Ritz-Carlton and the Mara. I think the big challenge there, which is a challenge across a lot of places, is the actual management plan around that specific reserve has been totally undermined by corruption. So, is it the hotel's fault? Yes, they're a part of it. But actually, why is the hotel being allowed to build there? That's a government decision, ultimately. It's a local government decision. There's a lot of people making money out of that situation, and it's just a free-for-all. And that's where you need the state. You need state intervention. In our case, for example, up at Swien, that's the only lodge on 44,000 acres. I mean, it's one of the lowest densities ever. And so having sensible tourism is the answer. And as consumers of tourism, being well informed around where you go, making sure that it is low impact, making sure that actually the tourism operator is giving back genuinely to the community makes everyone happier. So there's a real role to play for consumers to be knowledgeable about where they're going. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? I was curious, what's your personal draw to this mission?
Well, it started with pretty girls. I left them behind a long time ago. It's just in my blood. It's one of these things. I've always been obsessed with nature since I was a little person. And I was very fortunate, and then I followed that. And it wasn't, conservation is not an A to B career. You can't, when you come out of university, there's not someone standing in a stall saying, hey, come and work for us, Linklaters or Goldman Sachs. You don't have a conservation company saying that. You have to go and knock the doors down, get the experience. And I've just been so fortunate to be able to, some people just took a chance on me. And it was a big chance, as you could see. But, and now what fulfills me every day, the reason I get up every single morning is because I can see the impact. With so little, you can achieve so much. You just have to have, the willingness to try it. And there's not very many people who are actually on the ground doing the work. So when you are there having the conversations, you can become an amazing conduit for change. So it's the impact now, the places like Swien, Loisaba, the work on the ground, seeing people just, their attitudes change. I mean, that's better than anything, even pretty girls.
Thank you. I had a question about poaching. I was in a African park in Malawi, and I had talked about poaching with some people that work there, and they said the main issue now that they have is people poaching for bushmeat, and so they have a huge part of their organization working towards creating a better sustainable life for people around the park as well, so that they don't have to poach for food. So I was wondering, are you doing something similar, or do you have issues with poaching?
Yeah, there's a big difference between poaching for ivory and rhino horn, and sadly, big cat bones is a big issue as well for the medicinal trade in Asia, and bushmeat, which is often subsistence. So what you do have, particularly in Central and Southern Africa, is you do have a lot of demand for bushmeat. It's a major form of protein. So the challenge is actually being able to create co-benefits, because the biggest danger is to punish your neighbors for being hungry. And that's a big challenge. So I think when you are hearing about anti-poaching and seeing guys and girls, you know, in uniforms going out to do anti-poaching, and it's very, that kind of energy is, it can be quite a sort of masculine image that's sent out. It's absolutely necessary having, you know, anti-poaching, but it's really important that there is a carrot and an incentive as well. So yes, it's important, especially commercial bushmeat poaching, which can be, I mean, you know, there are places in Angola where we saw kilometers and kilometers of snares that were put up. They're like, it's like sort of trawling for bushmeat. And in those sorts of cases, having law enforcement is so important. And what we've done is we really invest in the judiciary. So we invest in prosecutors, the rule of law, but we try so hard not to punish our neighbors, so that they are employed, that there are benefits that are coming to them. And that's the tight rope you need to walk in conservation when you're taking on these protected lands.
Okay. Question, you mentioned there was threats to your work. How did you mitigate those threats, and where did they stem from?
Gosh, that's a good question. So the threats, the biggest threats I've had were in the early days when I was very much on the front line. And I just really enjoyed being on the front line. That was just sort of, you know, what I do. So I'd throw myself into everything. That was just being young and stupid, quite frankly. I think that what I've done is really moved away from being in the front line and supporting those who should be in the front line, the local guys who are employed, are representatives of their communities, playing that role, and building alliances. So building alliances particularly with political leaders at all levels. And that's been very helpful. I still have, you know, you all have enemies in this space, but it's really by just being very strategic at where I play a role. I think, you know, I've lost a lot of friends in conservation in the last decade, and primarily it's because they've been in the front line. They've either been in, you know, in aircrafts flying over poaching situations, or they've been really public about their role in anti-poaching or law enforcement. And I think in this day and age, there's just no need to do that. There's plenty of local people who want to do that work and are better suited to it. And B, I think it just doesn't make sense. So I've just been much more strategic as I've got older.
In your decades of experience working with elephants and political leaders, what has been the most surprising or counterintuitive thing that you've learned?
That's a very good question. I think that I was very, very surprised. I think I was very surprised. There's a few things that really surprised me. I was very surprised that around these zones of risk that elephants don't cross, and how the threat of elephant mortality can stop elephant movements in its track. So, for example, in Kenya, there's these hard boundaries. We've just seen some of these fences that are created, but we've got elephants. We've got 20 years of elephant collar data, so an hourly position, and actually it's beautiful to look at. And I'd love to do an art exhibition of all these dots because they make incredible patterns. But when you interpret those patterns, there's a place in West Laikipia, which is again near the Rift Valley in Kenya, and the elephants don't cross a boundary. They don't go across it. And I've gone up there. I've been like, the habitat on this side of the boundary is the same as this side. But if elephants cross that boundary, they go into a place where there's a tribe called the Pekot, and the Pekot kill elephants. I mean, you know, if you're a Pekot warrior, you take a piece of an elephant back to the village, you get to marry the prettiest girl. So I mean, that is a big issue for those guys. And what it does is it creates this line in the sand. I think that was a big shock to me, because what it suggests is that sometimes you need to have that boundary in a human world to stop elephants from causing these problems. And I think that was a big surprise for me. And the second biggest surprise is that, I mean, I don't come from a family that hunt. I mean, you know, the girl who took me out to Kenya, her father was actually a hunter. And I remember him looking at me in the eye, and we were surrounded. It was a bit like going upstairs. You're sort of surrounded by all these carcasses on the walls. I remember asking me, you know, have you ever killed anything, Max? And I said, well, I ran over a badger once, sir. And, you know, but it was like deeply uncomfortable. But what surprised me was how knowledgeable he was about nature and how he became one of my first teachers. And I grew respect for hunters that I never thought I would have before I lived in Africa, and that they are as much a part of the conservation community as the non-hunters. And that was a real surprise to me. And I think it can be uncomfortable saying that in a public setting, but there are a lot of people with that knowledge. And the other person who was my teacher was Gobo. And Gobo came from a tribe of Walangulu who used to shoot elephants with a longbow that was poisoned at the tip. And his love and affection for elephants was much more than I saw in so many other people. So that was a real shock and a revelation to me. So I think that's been the biggest revelation, if I'm totally honest with you.
Thanks so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask a bit more about your vision for 2026. You said that media and news and storytelling and all the great visuals that you've shown us here was a big motivator. So what's going to happen next for Space for Giants? What are you hoping to do next year?
Well, my board are always telling us they say, look, Max, small is beautiful and less is more, and that's never been our style. So what we're really looking at doing is doing a few small things very well. The first thing is I really want to see if we can make, I mean, we've done 2 protected areas in Kenya, and we've now gone into Pinupe, which we signed an agreement with the government 3 years ago. It's an altogether more difficult challenge, and the politics are massive. There are about 100,000 head of cattle in that park that shouldn't be there. So what I'm hoping we can do in 2026 is really work with the communities to bring the cows into a managed grazing system and to tokenize that and turn that into credits or partnerships with a corporate. So my big hope is that in Pinupe we can turn that into something which can be a model for how to fund co-management. Co-management is a model. It's definitely one that, you know, I think philanthropy is going to support and it should support, but trying to do it in a way that's financially self-sufficient will allow us to scale from 160 protected areas to 8,400. So that's what I'm hoping. And then in Gabon, there was a coup 2 years ago, and the new regime has got a very different, much more pragmatic approach to their resources, to be candid. And we've stopped them from shooting the elephants, and that partnership has opened up a conversation. But they want to see income from these protected areas. If these protected areas don't generate income, they're going to convert them into logging or mining or oil or whatever it is. So in February, I'm heading over with some tourism operators, some responsible tourism operators, to see if we can bring them into the country and turn that Eden into the Costa Rica of Africa, at least start the process. So that's something I'm really hoping we can do. Gabon's a gem on the continent, and it's just too valuable to lose. So that's a big challenge for us. Sure.
Thank you so much. That actually feeds into my question. I'm right here. One of the conservation successes I've seen around the mountain gorillas has been able to monetize the protection for local communities. Whereas elephants, it's such a wide expanse of area. what have you guys been doing with local communities to incentivize people not to hunt bushmeat or things that are, like, at their heart, part of their survival? You know, what are the incentives that actually work in communities that are beneficial to the local people?
You know, I think that's the key issue, is that, you know, is ensuring that local communities are vested in the future of their wildlife. And so certainly in the case of, I think, Sweden, it's and Loisaba, Pinupe, number one, I cannot state this enough, it's jobs. You know, people often think, oh, well, you know, we'll build a school, community projects, that's important. But it's, you know, communities, it's a very romantic term, and academia gets torn apart all the time. We use that word quite loosely. The reality is that people are people, you know, sometimes they're cohesive and sometimes they fight like hell. And sometimes it's quite hard to get them to come together and do something. I mean, the first fence designs we did in Gabon, we created anarchy, because we're like, hey, you guys, you know, we're really dumb people from outside. You guys get together and you can farm collectively and all share in your produce. So they're like, whatever. we want to get food for us. I'm not sharing my food with that person. That's just like, okay. You know, so jobs, actually hitting people at the individual level is what's so important. And then ultimately it is about, you know, really building those relationships and trying to get things going in terms of school, healthcare, security. Security is a big one. I think a big surprise for me, and the question of surprise has been the social impact of conservation. There are parks in DRC, and you may have heard of them. I mean, there's quite a well-informed conservation community here, but like, for example, Virunga National Park, Goramble National Park. I mean, Virunga National Park, and that's if you divide it into three. In the south, you have the FDLR, who are the sort of leftover Hutu guys involved in the genocide, right? And they're down there, and their business is charcoal burning. And the park manager, Emmanuel de Merode, who I have a shrine to and worship on a daily basis, you know, he negotiated with those guys and said, look, you know, like, can you not do this so much? And so he's managed to build that partnership. In the middle, there's another group called the Mai Mai, and they are like illegally fishing and mining, and so that's another group. And then in the north, you have an Islamic fundamentalist group that want to turn Uganda into an Islamic state. And so, like, you got all of that in one park, and yet there are still mountain gorillas, elephants. They might even have a okapi in the north there because of conservation investment. It is awesome. And in terms of where that place is, it's in the most insecure part of planet Earth. And yet there's still some benefits coming out of it. Now, if that is an advertisement for conservation, I don't know what is. But if we were investing in protected areas, like archipelago protected areas around DRC, would you need the UN? Would you? Absolutely. This is an amazing solution. It's actually investing in nature for people. And that's been the biggest surprise for me. And I think it's a huge opportunity. And I mean, you know, it's something that I'll go, I'm supposed to go to DC next week. God knows who I'll see. But it's something I really want to promote is, you know, here's an opportunity to do something that really works and has enduring benefit for people. And I think that's been just an extraordinary revelation for me. Boom. Exactly, yeah.
We have time for maybe 2 more.
Merode is my personal hero also, and has been for years. We haven't brought anybody there to Virunga yet because can't afford my insurance rates if I take them there, but we'll get there. My company, Destination Wildlife, takes small groups of responsible tourists on these wonderful excursions that raise money for conservation here and there. And we absolutely believe that we need to put money directly in the community. So my question to you is, You mentioned the one property where And Beyond goes. We are not And Beyond. Where on your properties can I bring my folks, my small groups of responsible tourists?
We have a little travel subsidiary called Journeys for Giants. So we actually take, we partner with people who want to come out, and we get them behind the scenes, whether it's helping with a fence or an elephant collaring operation or a protected area. So we'd love to chat to you guys and bring you to places that you wouldn't normally go.
Maybe one more?
Thank you. So I think when you have an audience like this and we hear that an elephant was shot because it was raiding crops, or a leopard was killed because it killed livestock, I mean, we all just sort of can't believe that the value of a cow or a crop is worth, right, the life of one of these amazing animals. Have there ever been any kind of international funds set up to compensate farmers or tribal people for what the damage that the animals do? And I know that there are government subsidies and it might get very political, but I mean, if all of us could say, what could we do? And I could say, oh my God, I could give $50 for a cow that was killed. I mean, I think everybody would be opening their pockets, and it just seems so obvious. Is that?
It's a great question. I mean, the reality is that compensation schemes, I mean, these are government compensation schemes, are beset with problems. I mean, it's amazing how many cows get killed by leopards when there's a compensation scheme around. I think there's a few places where it's worked really well. I'm aware that there's a compensation scheme around Amboseli for predators, and I think there's been some relative success there. But it's just really hard to make sure that, and the same problems here in America, I think, where you have, I think it's the EPA going out and making sure that wolves have actually killed a cow and it's not just been, I don't know, got caught in a fence or something. So I think, the reality is conversation is really hard. The Gabonese government, before an election, suddenly does a massive compensation scheme. And you can imagine that makes everyone really happy, and suddenly everyone's had their crops raided. So it's so hard to do the monitoring and enforcement on it. So I'm not a believer in the compensation scheme. What I am a believer in is insurance. I think there's a huge role for insurance to happen at a micro level. So if someone is fulfilling certain conditions and then they lose their crops, they get a payout. That to me is kind of sensible, and then you can move beyond this real issue of cheating the system. So that's my personal view on compensation.
Okay, Max, thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you, Max. My big takeaway is that last line: investing in nature for people to benefit people. That coexistence exists. It's possible, and just that solutions are out there, and the scale of your solutions is so extraordinary. So anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. Max will probably be at the bar till 9:30. He arrived from Kenya today, so he's probably a little tired. But yeah, thank you. We'll see you downstairs.